Good evening. I'm Janice Weinman Shorenstein. I would like to welcome the over 1,300 people on the Zoom tonight to the 25th anniversary of the Mona and Otto Weinman Lecture Series. I was privileged to establish the first annual lecture series at the museum and am humbled by the memory of my parents, who I adored and revered, and also by the commitment of the museum to offer the opportunity to thousands of people over the years about both the experiences during and the consequences of the Holocaust. Tonight, we will hear about the material remnants of the Holocaust, those remaining tangible items that allow people to hold on to their memories, to reconstruct the moments attached to those objects. For me, and for so many others, the memories come from stories, photos, tears shed at ceremonies of remembrance, painful expressions when names of the past are recalled. It is in this context that I share my own story of an object that has held profound meaning for me in learning of my family's past during the Holocaust, an object that bears witness to the memory and meaning of death and survival. Symbolically, it was at the conclusion of the first lecture of the annual series in 1995 that a man approached me and asked if he could speak to me. Immediately, he informed me that he not only knew my father, Otto Weinman, but also my uncle Paul. Curious about the connection, I asked him how. I met your uncle in Auschwitz, he explained, and your father was the first person I saw when the Allied forces liberated the camp. Quite impossible, I retorted, absolutely stunned by his claim. My uncle was in the Dutch underground throughout the war, where he was ultimately killed, and my father served in the Allied armies for many years, but never in the liberation forces. Oh no, he replied, pulling out a small plastic bag from his pocket. I was a young boy when your father marched into Auschwitz, lifted me up in the air and kissed me. And when I started to cry when he put me down, he gave me his army decoration as a keepsake. Pulling the ribbons from the plastic bag, he showed them to me. Overwhelmed with emotion and absolutely incredulous, I asked him to give me the decorations as a token of my father. He refused. This is my symbol of hope that he gave me, of the light he shed on the rest of my life. Many years later, I visited Theresienstadt, only to face the stark realities of my family's past. There I learned that, in fact, in June of 1944, my uncle had been deported from Holland to Theresienstadt, and then in September of that very same year to Auschwitz, where he ultimately met his death, along with every other member of my father's family. My father, in his Allied uniform, must have gone to Auschwitz to try to find his brother and was mistaken as someone in the liberation forces. As striking as it was that I was able to piece together this narrative was the fact that my father never shared it. Instead, he would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming for his brother to keep running in a field where he imagined the Nazis were shooting him from the rear. The material objects that exist are testimonies of the Holocaust, which are bound up in such stories. But the significant point for me is the importance of the retelling and the continued recounting. This has become even more present to me in the last few years as anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and white supremacy rears its ugly head once again in this country and around the world. I am honored to serve as the CEO of Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America. Recently, we were the lead organization in the effort to enact the Never Again Education Act, which, now law, will provide resources through this museum to schools throughout the country to offer Holocaust education. As you know, study after study shows the lack of knowledge of the Holocaust among young Americans and children around the world. The words "never again" will remain only a slogan if we, as a nation, as people committed to obliterating hate, do not work with the Holocaust Museum and in our communities to ensure that the next generation is made aware and understands the consequences of bigotry, prejudice, and anti-Semitism. As always, I end my introductory remarks by thanking the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for its partnership in offering this series, which I hope has brought insight and inspiration to many over the years. It is but one avenue for ensuring that the Holocaust remains a reminder to us all to fight against the forces of evil and the perpetuation of hate. Only by raising and lifting our voices, only by standing on every platform, only by exerting our moral conviction to replace prejudice with knowledge, will we be able to do justice to those who lost their lives for no reason other than that they were the victims of bigotry. It is my pleasure now to introduce Lisa Leff, Director of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the museum, who will interview our guest speaker this evening. Thank you all for joining us.
Janice, thank you so much for your remarks and for your ongoing support and partnership. Tonight, November 9th, is an important date. It marks the anniversary of the Kristallnacht pogrom. We're remembering that terrible night and the murderous violence against the Jews of Europe that it unleashed. And in its memory, we're bringing you a program about how we remember and teach about that history. During tonight's program, I'd like all of you, if you have questions, to type them into the chat, and there will be time at the end of our conversation to answer them. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Leora Auslander. As Leora's former graduate student, I could not be more excited that she's joining us tonight. Leora is the Arthur and Joanne Rasmussen Professor in Western Civilization and Professor of European Social History at the University of Chicago. She's well recognized for her achievements with awards and fellowships, too many to name tonight. But because she's going to be talking to us about the history of objects, I do want to mention a few of her most notable publications on the subject for those of you who might want to follow up by looking at them. I'd like to recommend in particular a really important and field-defining article called Beyond Words that was published in the American Historical Review in October 2005. I'd also highly recommend her book about furniture, Taste and Power, Furnishing Modern France, published in 1996. And then finally, a more recent work, an edited volume called Objects of War, The Material Culture of Conflict and Displacement, co-edited with her colleague, Tara Zara. Tonight's discussion will be the first time that Leora turns her expertise on the history of things, the history of objects, to the subject of the Holocaust. Let me welcome you here tonight, Leora.
Thank you so much, Lisa. My heartfelt thanks to you, as well as the amazing team at the Holocaust Museum. I'd like to offer special thanks to Janice Wyman Shorenstein. I'm honored to be part of the series that she has made possible, and I was very moved and impressed by the family history that she recounted tonight. It's a telling example of the importance of things in the making of history and in the possibilities it creates for conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. So let's begin tonight with a definition. What exactly is a survivor thing, and how do you approach studying it?
In some level, the definition of a survivor thing is really simple. It's anything, any object that had of consequence for Jews in the period of the Shoah, of the period of the Holocaust. The range of these things are vast. Some of these things were things imposed by the National Socialist regime on Jews. You see an example here of the uniforms that Jews were forced to wear in concentration camps. You'll see in a moment also the example of the yellow stars that Jews were forced to wear on their chests when they circulated through the cities of Europe. But there are other things that mark continuity with life before the disaster. Things like this stuffed bear that were carried into exile, into hiding, sometimes to the camps themselves by children, sometimes entrusted to neighbors, also sometimes taken on the Kindertransport as kids were taken to England. There are also precious objects like this wedding dress, which might have been loaned to, given to a neighbor to hide and to protect. And finally, there's an example of the shoes, this very painful example of shoes that children wore, maybe the last shoes they ever wore. Then there are further examples, including those made by concentration camp prisoners, an example of which I'll talk about later tonight. My focus tonight, although one could talk about paintings and musical instruments, which are also survivor things, my focus tonight is on the face of it, banal objects.
So the title of our program tonight raises an important tension. Should we see these kind of Holocaust relics as personal treasures or public evidence? To get our thinking going, let's talk about a particular object. We've chosen the case of a French suitcase that is in the collection of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum. I think we have a picture of it.
Yes, and let me start by giving you a little context about what this object is and what it's doing in front of you tonight. When the Memorial Museum of the Shoah was preparing to open its permanent exhibition about the lives of Parisian Jews and their lives in deportation, curators from the museum went to the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum in the hopes of borrowing some objects to bring back for their exhibition. And they identified a number of objects that they thought would make a vital contribution to that exhibition. And in particular, they noticed this suitcase. And they were particularly interested in this suitcase and hopeful of borrowing it because it carried the name of a Parisian Jew. At the time, his name was Pierre Leleu. It had been Pierre Levy before the war, but he adopted the more French-sounding name, more neutral name of Leleu in the hopes of hiding. And they asked for, the French museum asked Auschwitz-Birkenau for a loan of the suitcase for their exhibition. The museum was unfortunately extremely reluctant to make the loan, and they were concerned that they wouldn't get it back and offered to send a picture in its stead, but a picture wouldn't have done the work that the suitcase itself would do.
So that doesn't seem too controversial to me. It seems pretty straightforward. What was the controversy about? I mean, was this suitcase, was Pierre Leleu someone very famous, or was this a really valuable suitcase?
Neither, actually, Lisa. Pierre Levy Leleu was a really pretty ordinary Parisian Jew. He had been in the wholesale jewel business before the war. He was married. He had two children. He was living an ordinary life. The suitcase itself is of no value in particular. But there were other reasons why this became so controversial. Pierre Levy was arrested, deported, and murdered in Auschwitz. His family survived. And again, the suitcase was just a relic of that experience.
So where does the controversy come in?
It happened because his son, Michel, who after his retirement, again, a not so uncommon story, after his retirement decided to look into his past and into his family's history. And he even changed his name back to Michel Levy, the name on his birth certificate that had been replaced by Leleu for the period of the war. And so he was recovering his family's history and his father's history in particular. And one thing he did was to ask the museum to inscribe his father's name on their memorial wall, of which there is a picture here. And after that inscription, and after the opening of the permanent exhibition, he decided to visit Paris with his daughter Claire, and both leave a flower for his father and visit the inside of the exhibition. And during the course of that visit to the permanent exhibition, his daughter Claire came across her grandfather's suitcase.
Oh my gosh. So how did Michel respond when he saw this suitcase on display in the museum?
Completely upset and distraught. And because it was a shock, he had no idea that it was there. No one did. I mean, no one in the family did. But after that initial shock, he was elated and viewed it as a sign from God, that this suitcase that he had thought never to see again, that he was familiar to him from his childhood. It was a suitcase his parents had used to go on vacation in happy times as well. And so it carried a trace of his mother, who had since passed, as well as of his father. And he asked, and he really wanted to keep it. He wanted to take possession of this thing. And he felt particularly strongly that the suitcase that I had last left France in his father's hand to go to accompany him to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where he was interned and murdered, that he couldn't bear the idea of the suitcase going back there.
Yes, of course. So was he able to do something about it?
His first move was to ask Jacques Frege, the director of the museum in Paris, to negotiate for him with the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum so that he could reclaim his father's suitcase. This put Frege in a very difficult double bind, because he had promised the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum that despite their fears, they would get their suitcase back again. And so Jacques Frege tried to work out a compromise. He suggested to the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum that they keep possession of the suitcase, keep ownership, but they put it on permanent loan to the museum in Paris. So at least it wouldn't have to make that trip back again, even if Michel wouldn't get to have possession of it. But they had, after lots and lots of backs and forths, the museum said no.
They said no. What was their reason?
They refused because they said that it was essential that every object in their collection, and their collection means the things, the survivor things that were found on the site itself. They were produced in or used by people who lived and died in Auschwitz. They felt it was essential that those things stay there in order to counter the negationists, those who say that the Holocaust never happened, so they have this kind of proof, and for the pedagogic purpose. And they feel particularly strongly about that because the generation of eyewitnesses is passing. And so these things that touched the people who died are the only evidence, the only tangible witnesses in some sense to their experiences there. And something like the suitcase that was actually individuated, that has a person's name on it, that belonged to a clearly identifiable person, is particularly important to them. And it seemed especially important that they keep it there. So this need for educational, to go back to Janice's wonderful opening remarks, and evidentiary importance of these goods had to take precedence over everything else.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. What did the family respond? Did they agree to let it go back?
Michel saw the point. He understood, and he accepts the importance of Holocaust education and of the evidence. But his argument was, I'm not trying to empty the museum. I just want my father's suitcase back. It's a small thing to ask. You have thousands of suitcases. Just give me this one back again, and that I'll even accept that it stay in the museum in Paris. That's acceptable to me. A lot of frustration, and so he has recourse to the courts. It was not what he wanted to do. He has recourse to the courts. After 4.5 years of the case meandering along, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum decides on a compromise to settle outside of court, and they agree to loan the suitcase to the museum in Paris for a term of 30 years.
A difficult compromise. And just to pull back from the story for a moment, it seems like one of the things that this shows is that the suitcase means something different depending on which museum houses it.
Lisa, and the two museums have very different missions. And they're both absolutely valid ones. It's part of what makes this case so difficult. The Auschwitz-Birkenau's fundamental mission is to provide information, documentation, and education about the Nazi crimes and the genocide that occurred there. The people killed are of secondary importance in that context, and certainly the feelings of the survivors are of secondary importance to their fundamental mission, which is that documentation. By contrast, the Parisian Museum's goal is to document the lives and, if necessary, the deaths of French Jews before, during, and after the Shoah. They also have a very strong mission of service to survivors and their families. They view that their museum exists in part for them. And the issue of providing documentation of Nazi crimes is of secondary importance to them.
Yeah, but what about the victim, right? What about this family? Because what's so poignant in the case that we're talking about is that these museums are fighting over something so personal as a suitcase with a person's name on it.
I mean, the family's interest was just different from both of the museums. Although they didn't, again, deny the importance of those missions. The family just wanted the tangible material thing that it was Michel's mother who had written the label on it. So it was a thing with her handwriting. They wanted there and needed, it's beyond want, this relic, this personal treasure that had left their family, and that had to take priority. And the suitcase is particularly strong in that sense. It's a particularly important object because it's so intimate, and the mark of his father's hand was on it. And so Michel was very bitter that Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum was unable to see the urgency of his claim.
I see some questions are already coming in from our audience, and I'd like to encourage others of you who may be having some questions in your mind to write them in, and we'll try to get to them at the end of our program.
Yeah, so.
I'd like to turn back to you now, Leora, to talk about our another kind of survivor object, and that is concentration camp uniform caps, the caps that were part of those uniforms. You actually see a lot of them in museums all over the world, as well as in many families of survivors. We have a particular cap that we have a picture of here. Can we pull that up? What's the story behind this cap?
This is a very particular cap, at the same time as it's a cap that looks much like other caps that one has seen. This was the cap that was issued to Fajvash Davang when he arrived in Auschwitz. Fajvash Davang and his wife Shena were Lithuanian Jews who had settled in Paris, where they had a son. And during the course of the war, both parents were deported, and the Shena perished in Auschwitz, but Fajvash survived. And after his survival, he returns to Paris in the May of 1945, where he was reunited with his son Elie. And you see the family in front of you on the screen. After Fajvash returned to Paris, he felt very strongly about telling his story to his son, the story of his deportation and the experience in Auschwitz. He was somewhat unusual, actually, in being willing to talk about it at that point, but he found that he needed his cap to tell the story. He used it as a kind of prop. He made it speak. He made it represent his experiences. So it was an incredibly important object to him. And we know this in part because after his death in 1990, Elie, his son, and his wife found the cap sitting in a drawer in his father's apartment. And now Elie himself treasures this cap and says that after his own death, it will pass to his two sons, and the story that his own father told him will be carried on through his sons. So this cap has done different kinds of works over its lifespan so far.
It kept Fivish's head warm in the camps. And then it became a prop to tell a very difficult story. First Fivish to Eli, and then Eli to his own children. It was also became a relic or a personal treasure, something that Fivish himself needed to hang on to in a sense. And it became now, after Fivish's death, a memorial object, a kind of tombstone almost for Fivish.
Yeah, so you're saying it's done many different types of work, but all of that work has been within the family over time. I want to talk about, more about what's gained and lost that way, because when we were talking about the suitcase, it seems like, one of the things that's lost when it stays in a family is that the cap really could serve as evidence for the Holocaust to the broader public, like the suitcase does.
This is actually a slightly more complicated story, because it's true, the cap is still in the hands of the family. But as you see it on the screen, the family allowed it to be used as evidence in the Montreal Holocaust Museum's exhibit, Witnesses to History, Keepers of Memory.
Oh, okay. So in this case, there's an arrangement where the cap is both a personal treasure in the family and public evidence because it's in this online exhibition.
And this too is complicated because again, this is what the public has, this image that you have in front of you. So, and there's also a narrative about the cap, and there's a beautiful picture of Eli and Five. But what we don't have is scholars can't handle the cap, curators can't display it, technical folks can't analyze the materials in it, and visitors can't see it. And over the course of time, it's not in an air-conditioned space. Moths might get at it. It's not protected in any way. So on the one hand, yes, you can see it on the website. It's part of a beautiful exhibition, and that's fantastically important at the Montreal Museum. But for now, it really is a family treasure. And you might think of it as the public being given a glimpse of it, rather than it really playing both roles.
Yeah. So should this family or the others like them donate their things now, or at least get the next generation to commit to doing so? If they did that, then we would be sure that these things would be preserved and people could learn about the Holocaust through them.
Without question, but and many families feel that way, of course. But one shouldn't underestimate the costs to the family of giving up one of these things, even to a wonderful home and a place where it will be magnificently taken care of. As here you see one of these uniform jackets being carefully preserved and handled within the context of the United States Holocaust Memorial and Museum. So they're carefully analyzed. They're also stored. Maybe you can see the next image that shows that process. You see it now being put away in a drawer with fabric protection, handled with gloves. All of that's really, really important, but the family has lost it. They can't handle it anymore. And often as part of this process, not only do they lose the physical contact with their precious object, but a part of the story gets lost. And that's another issue. So it's both a very big deal to give up an object to a museum and a question about what happens next for the family.
Yeah. I want to pause for a minute to acknowledge some of our viewers who are tuning in from far-flung places, far from where I am in Washington or Leora in Chicago. We've got viewers from Glasgow, Scotland, New Mexico, Minnesota, Maine, Toronto, Montreal, maybe from some of the people from the museum, as well as Ecuador. Welcome everyone. I'm so glad that so many people are tuning in, and it's exciting to reach such a broad audience. Okay, so returning to our conversation. So whereas when we talked about the suitcase, we were talking about how the move from one type of museum to another changed the meaning of an object. Now we're talking about how the move from a family to a museum really changes the meaning.
Absolutely. A great deal depends on how the museum handles the object and what kind of information they're able to gather to go with it. We can tell the story with another cap, and maybe if we could put, yes, that this is a cap that on the face of it looks indistinguishable from the one you were just looking at, but is in fact an entirely different cap that tells a different story. This is Erich Sarkowski's cap, and it's in the collection of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And the museum has this cap, and it went through the kind of preservation process that you just see. So that's really important. It will be available for scholars to see for decades to come, and for visitors to have the possibility of looking at and imagining the experience of its wearer. But some really important information got lost in that transition from Erich's home to the museum.
I get what you mean when you say that the family loses something when they donate to the museum. They no longer have this tangible thing to tell the story. But I don't quite get what you're talking about when you say that information is lost, because I know that museums always collect provenance information when they get an object.
That's absolutely part of the process, and that information is extremely valuable and important. But when one looks, for example, at the record for Erich Sarkowski's cap, we find that there are things that we can't learn. What we can learn by looking at it is, because it's one of many caps in the collection of the museum, we can compare it with others, and that gives us extremely valuable information about the particularities of the conditions in the camp where he was, where they were able to source their material. This one we know is adjusted for size, actually, so that means that he had the means and the capacity to actually tailor his cap. We also have his entire uniform. He donated his whole uniform. So we can think about the cap as part of everything that Erich wore every day in the concentration camp, and understand how it kept his head warm while the other as best as possible, and its relationship to the jacket and pants and the other things that he had. The written record includes a fair bit of information about him and his family before the war, so we know where he came from. All that's very useful, but what we lack is much information about the relationship between Erich, the donor, and his cap, or the rest of his uniform. We don't know what he felt about it. We don't know if he ever used it to tell a story. We don't know why he gave it to the museum, why he gave it to the United States Memorial Museum rather than to some other museum, since there are other options. We don't know his hopes and fears for the cap in its later life. We also don't know anything about his family. We don't know if he had a son like Michel, who would have been upset about losing possession of this cap and of this uniform. So we really just can't know very much about the backstory, the context in the biggest sense, what gave this cap meaning to him.
Right, and we don't know what kinds of questions future scholars are going to want to ask. So in a way, you could never get all the information, right? And summing up where we are, I mean, it seems like when objects leave the family to become public evidence, scholars then have to work pretty hard to get back to those personal stories that you would also want to be part of the historical record. Before we move on to our third type of object, let me encourage all of you out there watching to submit questions into the chat, and we'll try to get at them at the end of our program. We'll move now to the final kind of object. And this is the case of two bras that are now housed in two different Holocaust museums. Let's get a picture of them up. Lyra, tell us about these objects and how they challenge what we know about women and the Holocaust.
Thank you, Lisa. These two bras help us counter or complicate at least an image that, that historians, particularly for the first couple of decades after the end of the Shoah, had of the importance, or rather the lack of it, of gender for the experience of being a Jew during the war and during the experience of the Shoah. It was assumed that what really mattered was whether one was a Jew or not whether one was a man or a woman. And these bras, read with and against the narratives that accompany them, help to complicate that story. They will tell us, among other things, that women had the capacity to make these bras. And let me just tell you a little bit about the two women whose bras these are, just sort of the context in which they were made. Hannah Messenger was deported first to Theresienstadt, that Janice referred to earlier in her introduction, then to Auschwitz, and then to Metzdorf, a labor camp in Lower Silesia, where she made this bra. Lena Berezin, the bra that you see on the other side, was interned first in the Kovno ghetto and then deported to the Stutthof camp, which is not far from Danzig, and that was a concentration camp.
Wow. So we've been talking about this for a few days now, so I already knew you were going to talk about it, but I still remain amazed that women made bras when they were interned in concentration camps. Can you just tell us something about how they were able to make them? It just is absolutely amazing.
First time I encountered these things, these survivor things, I was amazed too. It had never occurred to me that they were possible, that they would have been makeable. And it turns out that it's a complicated effort at sourcing, to put it that way. They were able to make the bras partially because they were able to recuperate materials. The buttons that you see on one of the bras was taken off a uniform shirt that one of the women had. Needles were traded or a daily ration of food was traded for a needle by Hannah Messenger so that she would be able to sew it. Some of the fabric was from the lining of a uniform, after which, of course, the uniform kept her even less warm than it would have before. And other things were found. A piece of glass was located that had broken glass from a window pane to carefully cut out the fabric that they were able to recuperate. So there are many strategies for finding the raw materials and the tools needed to make these.
Wow. So just while you were talking, I was looking at the objects themselves. What do you take from them? What do they tell us about the women that they belong to?
Very different kinds of information. First of all, if you measure the bras, they give you a precise sense of these women's bodies, the diameter of their chests, what their breasts were like at this point in their lives. This kind of information about the specificity of their bodies is something that was not obtainable by other sources. You know, the shapeless uniforms give you no sense of the bodies in them. We do know something about caloric intake, of course, and how much people weighed when they left the camp, but this gives you a very vivid sense of the size and shape of a body in the midst of this experience. A study of the materials, as what I just said suggests, gives you a sense of what was available in different camps, what materials prisoners had access to, what tools they had access to, and the time to put this together. So that complicates our image of the material everyday life of the camp. And finally, the form, looking at studying the form and the stitches and the way the bras were shaped, tells us something about the women further. That is that they were highly skilled, that they knew how to make these bras, that they could fit them to their bodies, making them without a pattern or any other guidance. So they're full of information.
Why do you think they made them? You know, was it for comfort?
Or at least that's only a very partial part of the explanation. As I've just suggested, because of the appalling diet and overwork, women prisoners had so little body fat, they ceased to get their periods, and their breasts almost disappeared. So they didn't really need the support of these bras. And I think that the purpose of these bras was far more as a different kind of memory prompt, to help them remember the bodies they had once had, to almost inhabit those bodies through the wearing of the kind of bra they would have worn, or as close to it as they could get before the war. And so they're really a matter of restoring, of trying to reclaim a kind of femininity, a sexuality, a kind of appearance that they had lost through the brutality of the regime.
How can you tell that from just looking at the object itself?
If you look at them closely, and maybe we could have them back, you can see from the darts on them, the way they're shaped, that they would have produced a bust that was fashionable in the 1930s and early 40s, a kind of high rounded bust, rather than the look that was fashionable previously in the 20s, which was a flatter look. So you can tell from the crafting at that level. They're also as decorative as was possible within the constraints. Hannah Messenger's bra, the one on the left, the décolletage is really shaped. It's a beautiful curve. There's a band of a different contrasting color. Maybe she ran out of the other fabric, but also maybe she was trying to produce an aesthetic effect. There are also the two separate linen strings that are used for the straps, which are functional, but they're also quite aesthetic and resemble other pieces of lingerie she might have had before the war. The other bra is less ornate, less decorative, but the colors carefully matched so that there's a unity. Other pieces of clothing made in the camps were made out of a kind of patchwork, out of whatever you could find. She clearly waited until she either had a single piece of fabric that was big enough or two pieces that really matched, so that she could make this bra.
It's amazing looking at them and hearing you talk about them, thinking about, the conditions under which they were produced and what they must have meant in those camps to the people who wore them.
Without question. And something I'd also like to emphasize is that not only do they mean something to the women, but they actually, the bras acted in the world, in the sense they actually helped the women survive. And so the women created these things for them. And then in a way, in exchange, the bras gave them dignity, gave them a sense of normalcy. And we know from much research that an essential part of surviving under these kinds of circumstances was to maintain a sense of oneself as human. And I think arguably for many women, a sense of oneself as a woman and having the body of a woman. So these bras gave that back to them in a context in which they had lost it. The power of the thing, we also know how important they were to the women by the fact that they've just survived. Because one could imagine that one's impulse upon liberation from the camp, because both women did survive, was to burn everything that had been with you in the camp. It was a horrible experience. Why would you keep this? And they kept them not just for a little while, but they kept them into their very old age. And so they were clearly invested in these bras and felt very strongly about keeping them, and then eventually donating them to two different museums along with testimony about them.
So what did they say about the bras in their testimonies?
Different things, but Hannah Messenger, for example, insisted that she made her bra just to ward off the cold, that was her sole motivation in making this bra. And Lena Berenson talked about being in competition with other women. Actually, it was an interesting narrative. But in neither case, particularly the argument that this was just something to ward off the cold, you have the sense of a retrospective storytelling, something that was very true to her when she was old. And this was a memory, this was a respectable narrative about what a prisoner in these, appalling situation would do. And I think it was complicated for her at that point in her life to talk about her desire to retain her femininity and sexuality, which might have appeared frivolous or not entirely legitimate at that point. So we have these two the narrative, the truth of the thing itself, and the narrative that she told.
It's fascinating. There's a difference between what a scholar can learn from the object itself and with the words that the donor says about them.
And I really want to emphasize, because of that, that the power of these things and the truth lies in both. That is, we need the object, the thing, the survivor thing, and its truth, because in this case, the truth of the bras is, and what we can learn about the experience of the camp is from the bra itself. And its material, in its materiality, in their materiality, they speak to us and they tell their story. And they actually tell Hannah and Lena's story of that time with incredible eloquence. The narratives that go with them tell us something about that experience. There's a lot of very important factual detail that's very helpful. They tell us something about their emotional states then as well. But they tell us, the narratives tell us as much about the long experience of being a survivor, coming to the end of one's lifespan and thinking about who one is now in life as an older woman, and how you want to tell the story of your experience in the camp, of who you were then. It's all true. It's just a very complex story. And so what we, just to kind of sum up where we've been, I think that what I hope has emerged in this conversation is the incredibly important role of survivor things, pedagogically and as evidence, but also as emotional objects, and that it's vital to keep all parts of those stories alive. And to do that, we need to have the things themselves and the fullest possible story around them, all of the versions of what they were. And I think we also need to respect the donors, the families' attachment to these things, and to work through this careful balancing between the vital needs of survivors and their families for continuity, for memory, for communication, for these relics, and the needs of institutions to have the means with which to communicate that story to a public now and into the future. It's possible to balance it all, I think, but it's a complicated thing. I'd just like to end also with a brief comment, because I know this, a more familiar encounter with survivor things is often through the goods of great value, like the Klimt painting, over which there was much debate, and the whole role of the courts in this. And I'd just like to emphasize that while those stories are very dramatic and important and well worth, and the issue of getting works of art back to donors is an important one, these stories of ordinary people who didn't have the money to own Klimts or other such things are absolutely as vital to our understanding of the Holocaust and the preservation of their things, the banal bra or a comb that somebody had or a teddy bear, and the stories with them is essential to doing honor to them and to all of the victims of all forms of genocidal practice. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Leora. If we were in a room together, now would be the clapping and the turning to the audience for questions. But so I will stand in for that and thank you. And then turn my eyes to the audience and say, please type in your questions into the chat. There's so much more to get from Leora's expertise. Let me pull up, because some questions have actually already come in. Here's one. What are some of the best ways to ensure that these Holocaust relics are that are donated to museums don't lose their meaning when they're moved from a family home to a museum? Oh, asking the scholar, what should we do? How do we make sure these things don't lose their meaning?
And I think there are layers to that. Thank you very much for the question. Part of it is for donors who are giving things is to really tell to tell the fullest story you have, and including the things that are maybe not so easy to tell, and trying to dig out of the cupboards, the basements, the attics, all of the accompanying goods, to remember the photograph albums, the story that you were told when you were a kid, to really trust the museum with the fullest possible memory and documentation of this. And from a museum standpoint or a collection standpoint, to be very, very expansive in the definition of what's valuable information. And it can include things that don't seem at all interesting. Where somebody went to school, or what they, the fact that their teddy bear was stuffed into the bottom of their suitcase when they got onto the Kindertransport, or that they'd had really bad fights with their siblings about the board game. All of those kinds of stories, and it's time consuming. They have other things to do, but that's the crucial. It's crucial so that the survivor things don't go mute, and they can tell their stories.
Thanks. Here's another audience question. Oh, this is very timely. Today, researchers are not able to closely examine an object in person from the many angles because of the pandemic. We're not able to go to archives or museums. What are the digital alternatives, and can we learn anything from these photographs or digital alternatives to seeing objects in person, or is it just too challenging?
You can learn a great deal. So one should not give up. Nothing. I mean, I'm enough of a material culture person to say, in the end, you really got to go look at the thing. You've got to get into, But in the meanwhile, from the digital reproductions, and some of them, like the ones actually in your museum, Lisa, are the objects are photographs from many angles. You've got precise dimensions. You have very good, very detailed materials analysis. So you can really powerfully visualize the thing itself, and you work from that. It's also important to keep asking the question, what am I not understanding? I once worked with a photograph album that had been digitized and realized afterwards that I had misread the order entirely because I didn't have it in my hands, and that it hadn't occurred to me to worry about how it had been photographed. That kind of thing. You need to really be attentive to the details and imagine and pose the question, well, what did the photographer do to take this picture? And you can ask questions. You can write to the museum and say, well, I'm studying this object from your website, and can you tell me more? Or am I right about this? So it's certainly possible. You just it's a very good stand-in until you can actually see the thing itself.
How do museums categorize items in their collections? Is there a way for family to maintain connections to an object once it's donated to the museum?
Also, these are all great questions. Thank you so much. This varies with the museum, of course, so I can't make blanket statements. But yes, families can maintain connections in the sense they can go visit their objects. But generally, they are then subject to the same constraints concerning handling it and as any other visitor. So you wear your gloves, you keep your distance, you handle it in a way that helps guarantee its preservation. You can't take it home for a visit, for example, in any museum I know about. Once it's there, it's there. And you also can't control when it's going to go on display, if it will go on display. It might become part of the study collection. But you can maintain your contact with it. You can also ask a museum to put researchers who are interested in it and you into contact. And in some ways, then you can have a really rich relationship with it, because then you know that it's living again. It's helping to tell the story of your relative, of the Shoah, of the larger event. And you can meet the scholars who are currently at work on it. Or if it's going out to a classroom, say, to help teach children, you could go with it, probably, depending on where it is, to the classroom and tell your story about it and watch the kids and their expressions as they, come to terms. So yeah, there's lots of ways of staying in contact. It's just a changed relationship.
One of our viewers, I can see, was very intrigued by what you said about the bras and what was said about them at the moment of the donation. And this viewer writes, do you find that how survivors describe the meaning of an object and their experiences always changes over time? And does that emotional attachment remain the same?
Yes, it always changes over time in my experience. And I think that the emotional attachment also changes in nature. It doesn't necessarily change in intensity. But what people need of these things, what they want from them, what they hope from them is different. When, at the moment when they made it, if it's a case of a made object, the moments where they gave it to a neighbor for safekeeping before they fled or went into hiding, the moments when they recuperate it and it becomes part of their life after the war, the moments when they have a child and it becomes a bridge, or when they are reunited with a child, and at the moments when they're imagining their own end and the question of what of them will live on and how will it will live on. So, I think it's I've not encountered cases actually where the emotional bond with the thing breaks or even lightens, but it does change in its qualities over the lifespan.
Leora, is this, and this has to be our last question, unfortunately. Is it different for high value objects, the kind that you said you weren't talking about tonight, art or pianos or things of that nature? Is that different?
Yes and no. Not necessarily. People, just because something has very high value on the market doesn't mean that somebody doesn't care for it passionately and not care about its value. It can be the painting that hung above the dining room when they were a kid, and they didn't care if it was a Klimt or if it was something that a watercolor their grandmother painted. And it's the emotional attachment. If it happens to be a high value painting, happens to be a high value painting. But obviously the stories change, and the way the world outside responds is very different often. Not always, because Auschwitz fought hard for that suitcase. So that's, museums will fight very hard for things that are valueless in that sense. But normally the state, the national state doesn't get involved. The court cases, the lawyers don't take on these cases in the same way. So the stories play out very differently. But I don't think that the emotional attachment is necessarily any different.
Thank you, Leora. So that was our last question. I want to thank you for our whole conversation tonight. And by the number of questions that I've seen coming in, I know that it's going to inspire more conversation beyond tonight in classrooms, and I hope in families. On behalf of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, I also want to thank Janice Weinman-Shorenstein for her steadfast support. Janice, supporters like you allow us to continue our work fostering the growth and vitality of Holocaust studies. For our audience, I'd invite you to go to our museum website to learn more about the work of the Mandel Center, including, for example, our residential fellowship program, in which scholars from around the world can come and spend 3 to 9 months doing research in our collections. May I also invite you to learn more about the museum's National Institute of Holocaust Documentation. Through its work, our museum collects original artifacts, documents, photographs, film, music, oral testimony, all to document the events of the Holocaust. There will be future digital events, such as the museum's Facebook Live series. Please come, and if you're free, watch our next program, which will in fact be held tomorrow, Tuesday, November 10th at 9:30 a.m. on the East Coast. And you can watch it on the museum's Facebook page. The program marks the anniversary of Kristallnacht. You don't have to be a Facebook user. You don't have to have an account to watch. And the program, of course, will remain on the page after it is live to be watched on demand. Thank you to all of you for tuning in this evening. We hope we'll see you again soon. Be well and be safe.